Welcome to GPOguide.com, video training session number 100.3, Introduction to GPMC Part 2. In this session, I'm going to go through some of the additional features and capabilities within the Group Policy Management Console as a follow-on to the last session where I focused on sort of the basics around getting around in the GPMC. In this session, I'm going to dive a little deeper, and I'm going to go ahead and start up the GPMC at this point. And when the GPMC comes up, you'll see that I'm focused again on the cpanel.com forest and the cpanel.com domain within that forest. I also have a Windows 2000 forest loaded here, test.tld. The first area that I want to talk about is security filtering and delegation and the capabilities you have around managing security within the group policy environment. And the first area that I want to focus on is the ability to delegate who can create group policy objects within a given domain. So by default, the enterprise admins group, the domain admins group, and a group called Group Policy Creator Owner are the only groups that are allowed to create new GPOs in a domain when you install Windows 2000 or Server 2003. But you may have the need, for example, you've delegated administration of group policy to a different group that's not one of those privileged groups. You may want to be able to grant them the ability to create group policy objects. So focused on the group policy objects container here, as you see I am in the cpanel.com domain, if I go over here to the Delegation tab and click on it, you'll see all of the users and groups that have the rights to create a new GPO in this domain. And if I wanted to add a new group, I can go ahead and click Add here and enter in the name of a group. And in this case, I have a number of groups with GPO in their name. I'm going to go ahead and check those, and it found the GPO admins group. I'll go ahead and add that group. And now the GPO admins group has the ability to create group policy objects in this domain. Similarly, if I wanted to remove somebody, I could click on that user account, in this case this user called Bill Evans, and click Remove, and this user would no longer be able to create group policy objects in the cpanel.com domain. Now let's take a look at the delegation that's available within a group policy object. As I mentioned in the Introduction to Group Policy training session, you can control the application of group policy through security group filtering. And security group filtering is essentially putting ACLs or access control lists on a group policy object to control which user or computer can process that GPO. If I go ahead and expand the group policy objects container, let's just go ahead and look at one of these group policy objects. I'll look at GP processing policy, and what you'll see here on the right is the security filtering section. This section lets you control which users or computers will process this GPO. By default, as you can see, the authenticated users group is the only group that's given this privilege. Now, if I wanted to control this group policy object such that only the GPO admins group that I was using before processed this GPO, I could simply remove authenticated users and then add my GPO admins group. And now, even though this group policy might be linked to a particular OU, the only users that will process it are members of the GPO admins group. Now, in addition to security filtering, there's another aspect of security with respect to a group policy object, and that's the ability to delegate who can edit that GPO, who can read from that GPO, and who can delete that GPO. If I go over to the Delegation tab on this group policy object, you'll see that I have essentially 5 groups here that have the ability to do things or perform tasks against this group policy object. I have domain admins, enterprise admins, enterprise domain controllers, group policy admins, and the system account. And you can see here the allowed permissions on each of these. So essentially what I'm showing here is that domain admins has the ability to pretty much perform any operation on this GPO. I can go in and with Group Policy Editor I can edit the settings on the GPO. I can delete the GPO if I'm a domain admin, and I can change the security. In other words, change the permissions in the screen that I'm looking at right now, as well as in the security filtering screen. One thing to understand about the delegation screen that you see here and the security filtering screen that we showed in the prior screen is that essentially these are all views on what's called the access control list for this group policy object. So if I were to bring up the access control editor for this GPO, what you would see here is these 5 permissions that I've set here, as well as that GPO admin's permission that I granted in the initial screen here. So all of these are different views on the single ACL or access control list. The difference between the view that you see here for security filtering and the one that you see for delegation here is that the security filtering view is showing you which users or groups or computers have read and apply group policy permissions on the GPO. And those are the 2 permissions that are required in order to process a GPO. Now, in order to manage a GPO, delegate its settings, etc., you need additional permissions, and those are reflected in these allowed permissions here. Now, if I wanted to change the permissions that a particular group had, let's say I wanted to prevent GPO admins from deleting this GPO, if I right-click this access control entry, I can change Edit, Delete, and Modify to simply Edit. And when I do that, this group no longer has the ability to delete this GPO. Now, one thing to keep in mind, these are all allowed permissions. As you may be aware, Windows has the ability to grant both allowed permissions and denied permissions. So in other words, I could say deny a particular user or group the ability to edit a GPO or delete a GPO, and in that case the deny will override any allows that might be set. So let's say I have a group called GPO admins, as I do here, and within that group is another group called GPO superusers. Let's say GPO superusers is a special subset of GPO admins, and I want to prevent them from editing this group policy object. Now, from this interface, if I were to try to add a new permission set, if I added a group, let's just say I'll just use the GPO admins group for the sake of argument. If I add this group, there's no ability to actually set a deny on this particular group. All you have are the allowed permissions, read, edit, delete, and modify. In order to set a deny on a particular ACL within a particular GPO, you actually have to go over to this Advanced tab. You click on the Advanced tab, and what you see is it brings up the Group Policy Editor, ACL Editor, so that what you're getting is the traditional ACL editor view that you would get if you brought up system file permissions or registry permissions or Active Directory permissions. And what you see here is that if I go and select a particular group called domain admins in this case, what you'll see is that it shows me the permissions that correspond here are the same as what's shown here under Edit, Delete, and Modify. So these permissions here basically correspond to edit, delete, and modify. Now if I wanted to, for example, deny domain admins from the ability to edit, delete, and modify this GPO, I could simply go in here and click deny on all of these allow permissions and say apply, and this would effectively prevent domain admins from editing, deleting, or modifying any of the attributes of this GPO. So, in other words, in order to set denies, you will not see them in the GPMC view. You have to go into this advanced view and manually create the denies within the ACL editor that's shown here. Now, what I recommend is, if you have to do this, that you start off by creating the allow permission with the permissions that you want. For example, if you only wanted to deny the edit settings permission, go ahead and select that group and create the add or create the allowed permissions so that you get all of the permissions set correctly, and then go into this ACL editor view using the advanced button and change all of those permissions to deny. And the reason I say this is because there may be additional permissions, or there is not a one-to-one correspondence between the name of the permission as shown in the ACL editor and the allowed permissions as shown here. And so, in order to make sure you're getting all the right permissions, rather than creating the deny ACL from scratch, I recommend letting the system create the allow ACL and then just simply changing all of those to denies when you get into this advanced view. Okay, so that's delegation on the group policy object. And again, this controls who can edit the GPO, who can delete it, and who can modify it. And the security filtering controls who can process the GPO, which groups or users or computers can process the GPO. And now I've shown, as an example, I've shown groups here, but you can certainly use individual users and computers. Typically, it's not recommended to do that because it becomes difficult to manage if you have lots of individual users and computers whose permissions you have to control, but it is possible to do that. The next area that I want to focus on is around setting delegation on a container related to group policy management. So let's go back up to the Marketing OU, and let's look at the Delegation tab here. Now, what you can see on this Delegation tab is a permission, link GPOs, and a set of groups associated with that. Now, this permission drop-down shows you a number of other things that you can do against this organizational unit, this Marketing OU. You can perform group policy modeling analysis, or you can read group policy results data. Now, these are two Active Directory permissions. In fact, all three of these are Active Directory permissions that are set at the OU level or at the container level that control group policy related operations that apply to the container. So if, for example, I'm a user in the Marketing OU that has responsibility for creating group policy for the marketing users, I might want this link GPO's permission. What this does is it gives me the ability to take a GPO that exists in the domain and link it to the Marketing OU. Now, if I wanted to add a new group here, let's say I wanted to go add my trusty GPO admins group to the Marketing OU to allow that group to link GPOs to the Marketing OU, I can add that group and then grant the permission either on this container, in this case the Marketing OU, or this container and all child containers, so that if there are subcontainers to the Marketing OU, I would also have that permission on that. And I'm going to do that because in this case the Marketing OU does have some subcontainers. It has the Users OU and the Workstations OU. And as you can see, in the Workstations OU, the GPO admins group shows up with the ability to link group policy objects, and as you can see here, it shows that it's inherited. Now, let's go back to perform group policy modeling analysis. Now, what this does is it controls which users or groups can perform a RSOP modeling run against objects within the Marketing OU. Now, I'll get into RSOP in a little bit, but this is basically the ability to do what-if reporting against a set of group policy objects applied to a particular user or computer in a set of OUs based on group membership and a number of other criteria. So being able to control who can perform this analysis lets you limit who has access to this kind of data. Of course, if an administrator can run a group policy modeling analysis, they can effectively see what your group policy settings are against a particular container or users within that container. And so it might be a good idea to be able to control that. And as you can see here, the default permissions on groups that have this capability are a very privileged set: administrators, domain admins, enterprise admins, and system. So not every user or group is granted access to this kind of capability. And finally, the group policy results data essentially controls the ability to read group policy results against objects within this OU, in this case the workstations OU. And if a group of users or a user has the ability to read RSOP data, then they can do an RSOP run from within GPMC against a machine in the marketing OU and get the results of what group policies were applied to that machine for that user. Now, similarly to the security filtering or the delegation that I was showing on a per GPO basis, there are no deny ACEs supported if I wanted to add a deny ACE to this list. I would have to, for example, go in under Advanced, again bringing up the ACL editor for this particular OU, and basically control the permissions based on directly editing in this ACL. So if I had GPO admins, and in this case what you want to do is click the Advanced tab to actually see all of the permissions that GPO admins has. And when this comes up, what you'll see is that GPO admins has the ability to write to specific properties within the this particular OU. And if we go ahead and expand this, we can go down and we'll see that even though it's grayed out because it's inherited at this level, that read GP link and write GP link are set enabled or allowed. If I wanted to disable them for the workstations OU, I could click here, and essentially these this ACE changes from allow to deny, and that means that this particular group policy admins group no longer has the ability to link a GPO to the workstations OU, even though it was inherited from above. So as you can see, if you want to set allow permissions, it's quite easy. If you want to try to control deny permissions, you have to go into the native ACL editor and manage the ACEs on these objects directly yourself. Okay, so now that we've looked at the ability to delegate or control a particular group policy object for management, for security filtering, a particular container like an OU for linking or for running RSOP, let's look at what kind of delegation we have at the link level. And what you're going to see here is that, in fact, the delegation is no different than what you saw when you were on a particular GPO. When I right-clicked on a particular GPO and chose the Delegation tab, the only difference that you see here is that in this view, when I'm viewing the link, in this case I'm viewing the Windows Firewall policy linked to the Marketing OU, what you see is a collection of both the security filter permissions as well as the delegation permissions for this GPO. So as you see here, the top one is authenticated users have read, and you'll notice in parentheses it says from security filtering. So that tells you that this particular permission controls who can process this GPO, and these subsequent permissions show you who can manage this GPO. What this tells you is that the permissions associated with the GPO are independent of the link to that GPO. The link itself does not store any of the permissions. You can't change the permissions on a link. In other words, if I were to change the delegation here for domain admins, this would be applied to the Windows Firewall GPO itself, and if I were to make that change and go down to the Windows Firewall policy down here in the GPO list, that would be shown, that would be reflected in this screen here under Delegation. So the security settings associated with the GPO are actually stored with the GPO. Okay, now what I want to do is get into some details around what kinds of information you get in the screen when you're focused on a particular GPO. I went through a little bit of this in the first section, in the 100.2 session on the Introduction to GPO, or to GPMC. Now what I want to do is dive in a little deeper and show you a little bit more about what's going on here. Let's go to the Details tab, which, as I mentioned before, shows you detail about the group policy object. The first and most important piece of information is the domain in which the GPO resides, in this case cpanel.com, the owner or the group that created this GPO, the date it was created and time, the date it was last modified and time, the version. When a group policy object is created, it's created by default on the PDC role holder within Active Directory. And there are two pieces to a GPO, the piece that resides in AD and the piece that resides in sysvol. Now, each of those pieces will replicate around as data normally does in AD between AD domain controllers. And for a particular domain controller, what I'm viewing here is the version number, or the number of changes that have been made to the user side and the computer side of this GPO. Now, the user side is showing here as 0, which means no user settings have been made in this GPO. The computer side is showing as 5, which means since the GPO is created, there have been 5 changes made to this GPO. The unique ID is the GUID of the GPO. You'll sometimes hear the GPO's GUID referred to. And GPO status is set to enabled. I went through this in the last session. If I go into the Settings tab, what this does is it creates a HTML report of all of the settings that have been defined in this GPO. And as you can see, on the user configuration side, even though it's enabled, no settings have been defined. Now, if I were to click Show All here, what you get is a detailed expansion of all of the settings that have been made within this group policy object. In this case, you see administrative templates, network connections, Windows Firewall, domain profile, and the Windows Firewall do not allow exceptions policy has been set to enabled. If I click on this, what you'll actually get is the explanation that comes along with this group policy setting. Now this is specific to Windows Administrative Template Policy, because Administrative Template Policy supports this notion of explain text. So not all policy will provide that detail. If I were to right-click on this, I could actually go in and edit this policy, and what it'll do is bring up the GPO in Group Policy Editor mode, and I can go in and edit the policy. Now, what it unfortunately does not do is take me to the exact place in the policy where this setting has been made. And similarly, if I scroll down, I can see other things that have been set. Now, this extra registry settings area here is an interesting one, because what it shows is areas that have been set in registry policy that do not have corresponding ADM files that GPMC can find. Now, GPMC uses an interesting mechanism for locating ADM files when it's showing you the settings view of a particular GPO. Because the ADM file can vary based on whether it's in the version of the ADM file that's stored with the GPO in sysvol, or whether it's the one that's found on the computer where I'm running GPMC. GPMC has to have a way of picking the right one. And in fact, if I go into View, Options, and go into Reporting, what you'll see is that you can control where GPMC looks for ADM files that it uses to generate the reports that I'm looking at right now. And as you can see, the default is that the console, the GPMC, will search the local Windows folder, and that's Windows-inf or /inf, which is where the ADM files are typically located, and then it will search the GPO folder in sysvol. What that means is that if it finds a version of, let's say, system.adm in the local Windows /inf folder, it will use that regardless of whether it's the correct version that was used when this group policy object was created. In that case, if the GPMC finds registry settings in the policy, in the group policy object that don't have corresponding ADM templates associated with them, it will list them here as extra registry settings. Now notice also here I can create custom locations. If I have a repository where all of my so-called golden or ADM files that are standard in my environment are kept, I can enter a path to those here, and GPMC will always get the correct ADMs. Now let's go down a little bit further, and basically that's the extent of this group policy object. There's nothing more in it. And if I go, let's try looking at another policy. Let's go to the security policy, and you can see here different areas of policy that are shown here. In this case, this one has local policy security options set, and I can expand or contract that. If I go and right-click on this, I can again edit this, and it'll bring up Group Policy Editor. So basically, the settings portion of the Group Policy object shows you the information that's contained within the group policy itself, within the Group Policy object itself. And this can be useful in terms of finding out quickly finding out what settings a particular Group Policy object supports. Okay, now let's take a look at the two group policy RSOP related capabilities. The first one called RSOP modeling. Group policy modeling. If I right click on the group policy modeling tab, I'll get the group policy modeling wizard. I can go ahead and start the wizard. First thing I want to mention about the group policy modeling capability is that it requires at least one Server 2003 domain controller in the forest in order to actually run. It uses a service found on that domain controller to perform the group policy modeling function. So you need at least one of these running in order to do modeling. And in fact, when Group Policy Management Console loads, if it does not see or does not find a Server 2003 DC, it will actually not show the Group Policy Modeling node that you just saw. Now, in the next step, it lets me choose a particular domain controller to run this process on. I will leave it at the default, which is any available domain controller. Then it lets me set a particular container or user or computer that I want to simulate. Now let's go through what this means. In the case of the user information container, I could enter an OU that contains a set of user accounts. And in the computer information, similarly, I could set an OU that contains computer accounts. So I could run the model against OUs instead of individual users or computers. If I did that, then what the model is telling me is that this is the effective policy, or this is the policy that will be received by all users in this container or all computers in this container. And that may be useful and may be a good thing to be able to understand, assuming you don't have any security filtering or other things that are controlling subsets of users within those containers. So let's go ahead and we'll go ahead and select a container for user information. In this case, I'm going to go into the Marketing Users OU, and under Computer Information, I'm going to go ahead and go into the Marketing Workstations OU, and what this will tell me is for my marketing users logging onto machines in the Marketing Workstations domain OU with user accounts in the Users OU, what the effective policy will be. Now, what I can do here is I can do a set of modifications to the default behavior. Slow network connection, I can select this, and that will tell me what the effective policy will be if a slow link is detected. Now this is useful because effective policy changes based on whether the computer detects a slow link when it's connecting to the domain controller where it's processing policy. So if I click this, it will model or tell me what the effective policy would be during slow link conditions. Similarly, for loopback processing, I can enable loopback, and if this machine is set to use loopback policy, or if the computers in this OU are set to use loopback policy, I can model what that effect would be on those users and the settings that they received. Now, I'll go into loopback processing in more depth in a future video, but essentially loopback gives you the ability to override user-based policy with computer-specific user-based policy, and it's used most frequently in kiosk or terminal server environments. Similarly, I can set the site available for this modeling session. So if, for example, I wanted to model the effect of moving a workstation from its current site to a different site, I could select that new site here and go ahead and run the model. And in this case, I'm setting user security groups. By default, the user is a member of these two groups, or users within this OU are a member of these two groups. I can simulate what would happen if the users were added to an additional security group. For example, let's try using my GPO admins group again here. And this would tell me if adding this group membership to my users in the marketing users OU would affect group policies, the group policy that's applied to them. And similarly for computer security groups, I could change the membership of the computer security groups to model the effect of that. I'm not going to do that here, but I'll go ahead and go to the next screen, which lets me select any WMI filters that might be linked to the group policy objects. All linked filters would assume that the existing filters, if they are linked, would be used in the model, or I could make a subset of those filters used. So if I wanted to change what WMI filtering was occurring, I could choose a specific set of filters. And then this is WMI filtering for computers, and I can do the same thing here. Now that I have all the data, I'm going to go ahead and click Next, and the simulation will run. And while it runs, it's collecting information about the effective policy for these particular users and computers in these particular OUs. And now that it's finished, I can go ahead and look at the summary report for this particular group policy modeling run, and it takes a bit to generate. But essentially what this does is it shows how group policy processing proceeded, which GPOs were processed, which containers those users and computers were members of, whether slow link processing was selected, the site that they were in. And here you see the applied GPOs, the user logon script, the default domain policy. These are being applied to the computer, to any computers in this OU. The denied GPOs and the reason they were denied. In this case, this one had a disabled link to the marketing OU. Simulated security group membership, simulated WMI filters. These are all simulated pieces of information. And then which client-side extension, which core component or a client-side extension ran in these particular scenarios. In this case, group policy infrastructure is the core part of group policy processing, and EFS recovery, registry, security, and software installation are the client-side extensions that ran for the computer. And then I go into the user configuration summary, and I can see the same kind of information. It shows here that I'm doing loopback processing in replace mode, and that these are the GPOs that ran, and these are the ones that were denied. And the group membership of the users, or the simulated group membership, the simulated WMI filters, and the simulated CSEs that would run. And then if I go to settings and do a show all, you'll see the actual winning settings and GPOs that would apply to the computers and the users. In this case, under software settings, installed applications, Office Professional Edition would apply on this machine, and the Office Deployment GPO is the one providing that. And this information down here shows detail about this package. Under security permissions, these are the permissions that are associated with this particular GPO or this particular set of settings. Actually, I'm sorry. This is related to the. This is still related to the Office application package, and additional information about the package. And then now we move into different setting areas. In this case, this is account policy that would be applied to these computers and the winning GPO. And we can go down the line to see all of the computer-based policies, and finally the administrative template-based computer policies, and how the various administrative template policies are set. And then under user configuration, we would see, based on loopback policy, for users in this marketing users OU, what packages, what settings they would get. In this case, these folks would get Windows Server 2003 Service Pack 1 Admin Tools Pack that just happened to be published as part of one of the GPOs that was in the path for being processed. And there would be a logon script that gets delivered, and some desktop administrative template policy that gets delivered. And then on the query tab, we can see the actual set of criteria that was used. And in fact, if I wanted to go through and change this, I could simply right-click on the Users on Workstations node within the GPMC and say rerun query, and I could at this point basically rerun the query and get new results, assuming something has changed in the environment. If nothing has changed, then the report as it's delivered would be the same. And group policy results is the next area that I want to focus on. Group policy results allows me to perform, unlike modeling, which tells me what might happen or what should happen to a particular set of users on a particular set of machines, group policy results tells me what did happen to a particular user on a particular computer during the last group policy processing cycle that user and computer underwent. So let's go ahead and right-click on that and run the group policy results wizard. And I'm going to do this on the computer that I'm sitting on right now, which is a XP workstation, so I'll select this computer. And of all the users that have logged onto this computer, I can choose either my current user account, which is the administrator account, and is not very interesting, or a specific user that has logged onto this machine in the past. So let's choose GP Smith. And that's really all the information that the group policy results wizard needs to generate information. And as you can see here, it's generated a very similar view to the modeling view, where it shows me which GPOs were processed. In this case, because it's a actual set of logs as to what happened in the past, you can see the last time group policy was processed, what site this machine was found in, the domain and the name of the workstation. Down here you see the applied GPOs, in this case the local GPO, the domain user logon, the default domain policy. It'll show you the state of those, in other words the fact that the AD and sysvol portions of these GPOs are all consistent and that they've had a number of changes on them. None of the GPOs that this computer processed were denied. These are the security groups the computer is a member of and any WMI filters that might have applied. And then here it shows you some information about the last time each one of these parts of the group policy processing cycle resolved and processed and what they did. And similarly on the user side, you get similar kinds of information. You get username that was logged on, the domain they're a member of, the last time user processing was applied, and of course user and computer processing can happen separately, and so they may not be happening at the same time. So this user, last time they processed group policy was on 11/29/04, and the applied GPOs and the denied GPOs. and again WMI filters and component status. And if I go into settings and I do a show all, this will tell me exactly what policy was run for this computer and this user. In this case, the computer ran a startup script called test.bat. It processed these account policies and local policies and event log and public key and etc. And if I go down to user settings, you'll see that there were some administrative template policies set for the net meeting component, and they were delivered by the local GPO. So you get a full view of what basically what group policy settings were applied for GP Smith on the workstation called WS-XP1. Now, a few last things I'll say about group policy modeling and results is you can right-click on a container and run the group policy modeling wizard from that container, and what that does for you is it basically fills in the information where I specified the container name in the previous wizard. It fills it in with, in this case, the marketing OU, so that you don't have to fill that in if you don't want to. Now, again, if you saw earlier in this session that I granted group policy results modeling permissions to the marketing OU and logging or results permissions to the marketing OU. That would affect my ability to run this wizard if I were an administrator that had or did not have those permissions on this marketing OU. So this modeling wizard capability may or may not run depending on those permissions. And I can also get access to this from the domain if I chose to do so. So in summary, we've introduced the notion of security filtering and delegation on GPOs, on the ability to delegate the creation of GPOs, looked at some of the GPO details, and looked at the RSOP results and modeling capability. In the next and final session on the Group Policy Management Console, I'm going to go through the process of managing backups, doing restores, performing copy and paste and import on using the Group Policy Management Console, as well as looking at some of the reporting capabilities. Thank you very much.